The Indiana Dunes is one of the most biologically diverse areas in the world. Today, on Roundtable Perspective, Dr. Mark Bouman from the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago joins me in examining the dunes in the Calumet region. Welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest, Dr. Mark Bouman. Today we're going to talk about some projects that the Field Museum is doing in the Calumet region and with the Indiana Dunes. Dr. Bouman, tell us, why does the Field Museum find us interesting?
In some ways, you could say the Field Museum's been in the Calumet region since it was born 125 years ago. We were an outgrowth of that World's Fair in Jackson Park and the south side of Chicago in 1893. And right at the end of the fair, the effort was made to let's have a fair every day. We've collected all this stuff. Let's have a museum and put the stuff in there, and let's open up exhibits and research. And from that moment, from the south side of Chicago, collectors, curators, scientists began to move into the interesting places of Chicagoland, and there's few places more interesting than the Calumet region. It's a hugely biodiverse area. It's also become incredibly culturally diverse and economically diverse as time has gone by, but that attracted the interest then, and it's held it ever since.
So how were they defining themselves as a museum back then that incorporated that, and how maybe has that changed today?
Yeah, what a lovely question. They literally, we actually have a beer now called Cabinet of Curiosities.
Really?
And that's because that's what museums of the day were. They were like the coolest large elephants, or the most exotic people were seen as exotic if they weren't from here. All of that's changed. It's still a cabinet of curiosities. There's still a collection of about 40 million objects and specimens, which makes it one of the top four in size of collection of natural history museums in the world.
So it's worth going there more than once.
Yeah, you can only hit the first 20 million on the first visit, and then you got to go back.
This dwarfs the Louvre, I think.
Well, right, and our famous objects are things like dinosaurs and things like that. But so we have this great collection, but what we do with it has changed a lot, and even, of course, how things were collected, but what we do with it and to what end, having a huge, it's like having a treasure. It's like, remember the old Donald Duck cartoons, and Uncle Scrooge had a huge room full of gold coins, and he just loved nothing but to just swim in it. And if we didn't do anything with it, we would just be Uncle Scrooge.
Yeah, you'd be sitting there.
But we got to invest it. We got to pay it back. It says we need to take action in the world to do things.
So you mentioned a collection of curiosities. I think I was in one of the original collections in Oxford, England. There's a museum called the Ashmolean. And I guess there was a man named Ashmole who traveled around the world and collected strange things, and I went through there, and it was pretty interesting.
Some of those collectors were, they had quite an eye. Sometimes they had quite a gun as well.
Right.
And but one of the things I should say is that by our sort of back of the envelope count right now, about 30,000 objects and specimens from the Calumet region itself.
Oh, that's interesting.
So a lot of plants, a lot of insects, birds.
But before we get to that, I'm just curious about this curiosity collection concept. There's a place called House on the Rock in Wisconsin, right? This is another individual who collected things throughout his life. So are we saying that was sort of the origins of the modern museum concept?
Most modern museum people weren't as sort of disturbed as the guy who built House on the Rock. Or if you've been to House on the Rock, it's like,
the Ashmolean's pretty disturbing too, actually.
No, I think they were, I think the impetus behind places like the Field Museum, some of it was just, let's be great. Let's be Chicago. Chicago in 1893, they showed the world 60 years after Chicago was founded with no 300, 400 people around. 1890, they hit 1 million people. And it's like, we are worthy of this attention. And so the appeal to Marshall Field was, hey, you know, if you invest here, everybody in the Midwest is going to come to your museum. Every kid in the Midwest is going to learn from what you've got here. So I think but individual collectors for sure have lots of interesting impulses as to how they do their stuff.
Of that. Well, there's a book for you when you retire.
About
people collecting things that evolve into being museums.
It's helpful to have collections just to be able to do science on them.
Sure. Oh, yeah. I mean, so obviously, there's greater value to it than curiosity.
Right. Well,
the Northwest Indiana area, the Calumet region. Well, maybe we should define that first. When we say Calumet, that's partially in Illinois. That's partially in
it's
Indiana.
A bi-state region. You know, it's. I think there's a border wall that runs down the middle of the region.
So take us from one end of it to the other. What do we mean by
I would say
region?
From you know, the shorthand way is, now that we have a new Pullman National Monument, is you can say from the Pullman National Monument to the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore and all the landscape in between. But
so Pullman being the suburb of Chicago, right?
Yeah. And you know, where the great factory and the civil rights, the labor history, all the stuff that happened there. Actually, the Little Calumet River makes a big hairpin turn at Blue Island. So Blue Island is, I-57 is about as far west as you would say. On the east, maybe to Michigan City, perhaps LaPorte, Valpo, depending on how you want to draw the lines there. You know, the glaciers came through and they piled up a big pile of rubble called a moraine. And the Valparaiso moraine runs around the south end of Lake Michigan. Some places as much as 200 feet higher than the level of the lake.
Really? And it's called the Valparaiso
moraine because in Valpo is where it's at its height. It's especially hilly around Valpo. There's the lakes, Flint Lake, Mink Lake, those places. And that curves around the Chicago region into places like Palos Hills and Hinsdale. That's all in Valparaiso moraine.
So this was the edge of the lake at some point, then, right?
Yeah. So the lake, you know, the ice is going this way, and then it pulls back, and it all melts, and it kind of leaves behind, like a bulldozer would, you know, big piles of boulders, sand, clay. It's just unconsolidated stuff. As it pulled back, though, and it was draining like a bathtub drain.
Not quite as quick.
No, but it left behind some significant rings. You know, and there's 3 very significant beach ridges through the region here. So, you know, the Glenwood, the Calumet, and the Tolliston beach ridges, each about 20 feet lower than the next.
Stepping down slowly.
Stepping down slowly as the you know, the plug
over a period of centuries.
Centuries, but relatively quickly in geological time, because we're only talking really about 10,000 years ago, you know, when the glacier was receding. And so, and you could think of the dunes as the most recent of this set of ridges. There's a particular set of them between about, say, Whiting and the Gary Airport, where the ridges are just a series of, it's like a washboard, you know, little tiny corduroy landscape, 5 foot high ridges, 5 foot low swales. That's called ridge and swale landscape. It's very rare, and it's one of the contributing factors in the biodiversity of the region, because every time you got a pile of sand and a pile of muck, you've got dry, wet, dry, wet, dry, wet. That gives it a lot of opportunities for different plants to grow closely to each other.
And I guess as recently as 150 years ago, most of this was underwater, right? It was drained.
You know, it depends what month it was.
Well, okay, not so much in the Illinois side, but I understand the Northwest Indiana
Northwest
side.
Indiana was incredibly wet, and Illinois as well. These, you know, the rivers that try to drain the area are wayward souls. The Little Calumet and the Grand Calumet rivers start over in the east near Michigan City. They can barely find their way to Lake Michigan. They go way to the west to Blue Island, and the Little Calumet does, and then it swings back around. partly because it's confined by these sandy ridges. And so it's very flat, except for these ridges, these little piles of sand. It's as flat as this table, and so those rivers have trouble. So the drainage of the region was actually a deterrent to settlement by European settlers for a long time. Didn't hold them off entirely. They were able to come in. This was a great area for Potawatomi. Because you had fishing, you had hunting, you had some places for agriculture. It was a hub of the continent even then. But when folks came who wanted to plant corn and soybeans, you know, it was rougher here because they were able to plant a lot of water, but, you know.
Plus, we're sitting on a lot of sand. I remember when I first started teaching in Hammond, and they were working on the road, and I saw this big mound of sand, and I thought, what do they bring all that sand in for? And I realized that it's what was under the road. Yeah.
So when I was a kid, and I would visit my aunt in Evanston and watch the campus take shape out at Northwestern University on a peninsula into Lake Michigan, barges of sand were coming in, and I loved watching that. But what was happening was that was Indiana sand dunes sand going to make Northwestern's campus there. A lot of that sand got mined. It ended up in ball jars in Muncie or in railroad grades across the region.
And I also understand that there's a richness of species here. We've been compared with places like Galapagos Islands.
Yeah.
Tell me about that.
Well, so, you know, Indiana's very much a hardwood forest kind of a state. Illinois is the prairie state. They both are here, and Michigan had its pine forest. So you really have three major biomes come together here. And then with the wet, dry thing, a lot more diversity. So the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore is definitely in the top 10 of all the national park units, and there's more than 400 of those in terms of total species richness, which is incredible testimony to something that can be that rich and hang on to that richness amidst, you know, being the nation's leading steel center and oil refineries and roads and railroads and pipelines and all that stuff happening here.
Yeah.
Species richness next to an amazing diversity of cultures.
And those things have survived? I mean, is this, because I realized with all of the
They have survived. Many have. Some are now gone from the region. The most recent and probably most famous to leave the region is something called the Karner blue butterfly. Beautiful little butterfly that was, I think, one of the type of blue butterflies that Vladimir Nabokov was a specialist in.
Oh, really?
But it blinked out in the very warm spring of 2012. This butterfly depends on lupins to come out of the ground. And the lupins came so early that year that they were there and gone by the time the Karners were ready. Yeah. And so the Karners are gone from this region, and other efforts have been made to try to hang on to the remaining biodiversity of the region and to connect it to each other, because the nature of it is it's a very fragmented space. You know, you drive along, you have a vast marsh or something, and then you're in a neighborhood, and then you're by a factory. So how do you connect those marshy pieces to each other is one of the science tasks of the area. And also, how do you stave off what are the key invasive species, like this huge reed we're all familiar with as we drive down the toll road called Phragmites australis. It's very dense. It chokes out other stuff.
Common name is?
Common reed.
Yeah, just the reeds.
It's a really tall one.
Yeah. Interesting. So what else stands out about this area? What else is unique here?
Well, I think one of the things that's most unique about the area is that it is at the very epicenter of the continent's activities. Its economic heart, its transportation heart, its commercial heart. Everything if it doesn't come here and stick here, at least it's going through here.
Yeah, these are real points of pride for the area, I guess.
Absolutely, and you know, probably the most connected space in America. And I would say the region, as we just defined it there. Yeah. Another point of pride for this region would be, if you include the Illinois parts, it's bigger than metropolitan Indianapolis. It's about 1.75 million people here. Yeah. Huge array of interstate highways, roads, railroads, and all that. Lots of pride. By the way, this Field Museum, our dinosaur, who was moved upstairs,
right? Yeah,
is named for
earth-shaking event.
Yes, Sue Hendrickson from Munster, Indiana. So
is that right?
So there's a direct connection to the region there.
Some of the other projects that you're working on. I know. Well, tell me about.
Well, let me just keeping with the point we were just talking about there. So one of the things we've done is to try to gather this together. It's people, it's nature, it's the economic pieces, and what is a good means to do that? And there's a thing called the National Heritage Area. And so we're part of a partnered effort to.
And this is the concept of the old park, only we're saying that it's going to be an area, so it might be park and then steel mill and then pick up the park again, and it could be spread out.
Well, and these national heritage areas are actually not, you know, bounded parks. They're living landscapes.
First one was in Illinois, wasn't it?
Illinois and Michigan Canal. Yeah. The Chicago region generally has invented lots of stuff. Yeah. The National Heritage Court, first National Lakeshore was the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore. Yeah. And those sorts of things are ways to cope with what we know to be important, and find a creative way to, you know, mark it out on the landscape.
So, you know, historically, there were periods of time where we were basically just exploiting areas like this. In the last, I don't know, 30, 40 years, we've tried to preserve things and actually tried to restore them. I know at Purdue Northwest, Purdue University Northwest just acquired Gabus Arboretum, which was an attempt by a family to buy up a lot of property and sort of take it back to its origins.
So here you put your finger on a couple things there. So Field Museum is a partner with Gabus, which used to be called Tall Tree Arboretum in Valparaiso. The Dunes Learning Center and the Shirley Hines Land Trust. In a program called Mighty Acorns, we kind of we developed the curriculum and trained teachers and stuff, and those guys are geniuses at connecting the kids from this region to these natural areas that are all around us in the area. Because that is part of how do you change a world around you is when kids have those opportunities. And we know, of course, kids don't spend enough time outside, and all this stuff our mothers told us is true. You know, stop watching TV and all that kind of stuff. But
we wish we'd listened. But,
But I think it's a great opportunity to celebrate what's happened in the last 30 or 40 years, which is what others have called a restoration revolution in Northwest Indiana. That's Lee Bott's phrase. The movie that Lee produced called Shifting Sands is, the shift is to acknowledge that amidst all this activity are these assets that are nationally significant, I would make the case. And so how to get kids to know that, how to get people who live here to celebrate it and know that.
I accidentally ran across some evidence of that. We did a survey for the Indiana Department of Environmental Management a number of years ago. And part of what we wanted to find out is how much do people know about the environment? And the people who knew the most about the environment and environmental issues were parents of school-age children. And when we tracked it down, we did some focus groups to follow up. Cool. They knew about it because their children were bringing things home from school that they were reading, projects they were working on. So that was more effective for them at that time than the editorials they were running in the newspapers.
Yeah, that's right. You know, and this region's been at the center of so much of this, of a national movement to sort of that combines things like ecological restoration, pollution prevention, environmental justice. Major elements of those got their start here. That's something that's not unique to the region, but something the region can be extremely proud of.
Yeah. So this interesting name here, though, the Map of Chicago Wilderness. What does that mean?
So, you know, the Field Museum, so we're this big, you know, marble institution on the lakefront, but our unit, my unit, which is called the Science Action Center, we work in partnership. And Chicago Wilderness is actually a partnership group of about 250 across the region, including especially Northwest Indiana. And the map of Chicago Wilderness is calling out the green spaces in the Chicago metro area. The particular map you might be referring to is the Chicago Wilderness magazine that existed until about 10 years ago. It was a wonderful magazine that sort of celebrated the treasures of the region.
Know, I bought one of those one day, I think, And
beautifully
I never
designed.
Saw it again.
You know, in some ways they've gone, it went the way of many good print publications. But there was a special Calumet issue with a pull-out map of the Calumet region, had all kinds of great photographs. I was the project director on that map. Before I came to the Field Museum, I was professoring at the time.
You have said that Chicago was not a good place to build a city. If we could just maybe wrap up by talking about that a little bit. I think that's a curious.
Yeah, and some of that kind of applies to Northwest Indiana as well. It is one of the worst possible places to build a city. It was also one of the best possible places to build a city. It was the worst.
The Charles Dickens version of it.
It was the West at times, what made it so awful is, for city building, is it's tabletop flatness and wetness. Getting water off the landscape, figuring out where you're going to get fresh water. Well, there's Lake Michigan over there, but if you're going to dump all your sewage into Lake Michigan and not drain it away someplace, Peoria, St. Louis, you're in big trouble. So Chicago had to invent a variety of ways to engineer its way into a healthy environment. The reason it's the best place to have a city is the fabulous connection between the Great Lakes, St. Lawrence, and the Mississippi River system that applies to the very end of Lake Michigan here too. You know, Gary, Hammond, Whiting, East Chicago.
So for the shipping trade?
Couldn't be better. World class. World class connectivity. You couldn't have a city in a better location than the Chicago metropolitan area. And nowadays, as we think about sustainability issues, I mean, I think that it's great to have the water of Lake Michigan. It's great to have the biodiversity around us. These are assets that we can celebrate in our lives right here in a region of 10 million people, generally in the Chicago metro, that we're not going to be that worried about where our next drop of fresh water is.
So if someone wanted to get back in touch with nature and they were going to do a weekend trip every month, what kinds of things would you suggest?
Well, I would suggest the Calumet Outdoors series. That's a monthly series. Go to calumetheritage.org is a website where you can find things both about the heritage area thing I told you about, but also about that monthly series, a hike across that region led by an expert. Field Museums, fieldmuseum.org.
We could still go to the museum, of course.
You're welcome. Please do. And we're beginning to work on pulling an exhibit together that will celebrate the Calumet region, and we're doing that with local partners as well.
Great.
Yeah.
And on the Illinois side?
I think the Calumet, big news on the Illinois side is
of course, I'm thinking Indiana when you say Calumet. I keep forgetting that we're talking about both sides.
Yeah,
here,
it's both sides. And I mean, even this, you know, the double-tracked, or to-be double-tracked South Shore Railroad will take you from the Indiana Dunes National Lakeshore to the new Pullman National Monument, and they're working on a good stop there, and right to the museum campus stop. So you don't even have to drive.
Yeah.
So Pullman National Monument, President Obama came there February 2015 and declared this new national monument. There's a lot of energy over there, and it's energy that folks in Northwest Indiana noticed at the time and said, how can we best connect that energy to what's going on here? And that's kind of where the museum's helpful, I think, in this context, because we don't own land and we're kind of a neutral convener.
Sure.
Some people have called museums temples, some have called them forums. What we're trying to do is to say we're a little bit of a forum in this public dialogue.
That's good, and when they're done, they can stop by the Obama Presidential Library, right?
In Jackson Park, a stone's throw from our first home in Jackson Park. Right.
Okay. That is all the time we have for our program. Thank you to Dr. Mark Bouman for joining me today on the Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.